Joining us now to talk more about all of this is Hal Kempfer. Hal is a retired Marine Lieutenant Colonel, former intelligence officer, and currently president of KIP, a strategic risk management firm. Okay, so Hal, lots to talk about here. I want to talk about Patrick Shanahan first. He told reporters that the Iran threats are on hold right now because of U.S. countermeasures. From an intelligence point of view, what would lead the U.S. to believe that?
Shana, for the Secretary of Defense to say something like that probably means that we had indications of warning that something was going on. That was pretty clear that there was definitely some sort of warning that they were planning some attack using proxies or something like that. However, our monitoring of those groups, our monitoring of that communications, our monitoring of their movements doesn't stop just because we move forces in there. In fact, our intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance efforts tend to increase. So we're watching what they're doing in reaction to what we're doing. We're watching their communications with proxies and with their own forces and others in the region. And that is an intelligence assessment, which is basically they have decided to back down in light of what we've done. And I think part of it is, even though rhetoric has been rather strong on all sides, the forceful rhetoric from the U.S., the moving of forces like B-52s, an aircraft carrier in there, sent a very strong signal. And I think it gave the Iranian government room to pause, if you will.
I wonder, though, but saying that the Iran threats are on hold, I mean, it is clear the administration is trying to de-escalate things. Is this a way for them to sort of save face, say that things are better now, we're going to back away from this situation without having to admit that perhaps they mishandled these tensions with Iran?
Shana, that would be certainly an interpretation of these events that maybe they overreacted, maybe a lot of the theater was involved on the international stage. On the other hand, there's another side, which is behind the scenes, which nobody can see. There's a substantial back down of Iranian posturing, despite what they say in real world, bringing the missiles off the boats, for example, which was a report out last week. They had a picture of that. All sorts of things along that lines says that despite the rhetoric, they are backing down. And the problem is, if you keep the pressure up, where do you go? Because if you keep putting the pressure on, the chances of misstep, a mistake, accidentally, inadvertently turning into a serious armed conflict becomes more readily possible.
Jim Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense, he just spoke. He was in the Gulf, and he said the answer to Iran is diplomacy, not war. Do you think part of the reason we're seeing an escalation is the fact that he's no longer at the Department of Defense?
I don't really know. I mean, Patrick Shanahan knew Jim Mattis. I have nothing but respect for General Mattis. I worked for him. In fact, for a short time, I was actually his director of intelligence. And he has a very clear mind. I imagine that, Secretary Mattis would have handled this a little bit differently. But then again, we don't have a view of whatever that intelligence is. And in this case, intelligence may really be driving not just our operations, but our strategy, our policy, and to some extent our rhetoric in ways that we can't readily see.
Right. And then, of course, we have the briefings today and lawmakers coming out, and some of them very frustrated, thinking the intelligence isn't enough to escalate the situation with Iran. We have about 30 seconds. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think there's a lot of politics there, and I'm sure a lot of them are assessing what they heard, what they saw, and there's a very good chance that what they heard and saw doesn't match with what they wanted to believe. And so I'm going to be watching for what they don't say as much as what they do say over the coming days.
Of course, they would argue you can say the same thing about the administration. Hal Kempfer, we appreciate it, as always.